I'm the co-director of the Middle East Task Force at the New America Foundation. I run it along with Daniel Levy. Now, in the invitations you got, you saw that Steve Clements was going to be moderating, and I was going to be a respondent. And Steve was doing what Steve does best, which is meeting hundreds of thousands of people all at the same time in New York, and unfortunately was unable to get back here in time. So we've changed the format a little bit, and Dr. Ashrawi and I are going to have a brief conversation that's going to be more me asking her questions. And
I could ask you back.
You could. But nobody here would really care as much about the answer. And then we're going to open it up to the floor and have a conversation with the audience. Since the Clinton Global Initiative is taking place simultaneously in New York, this is a very CGI format. So in honor of that, I've even worn my Bill Clinton tie. He has a... I want to introduce somebody that everybody knows. So that's more complicated than introducing somebody that nobody knows. Everybody knows Dr. Ashrawi. The reason everybody knows her is because she's become not only the most articulate and eloquent spokesperson for the Palestinian cause, but because in the Arab world, she's actually staked out a very unique position. There is no woman in the Arab world that is as well known as Dr. Ashrawi in terms of advocating not only for Palestinian rights, but across the board for human rights. And this is a very important thing to remember. One of the reasons that people like Desmond Tutu, for example, have such resonance anywhere in the world that they go to is because they have a morally consistent perspective regardless of the issue that they're discussing. They can be talking about Kosovo, they can be talking about Bosnia, they can be talking about Rwanda, Darfur, Sudan, Israel, Palestine, and they'll have a morally consistent perspective, not dominated or advocate by their ethnic background or by their specific political loyalties. Dr. Ashrawi falls into that category, and there are very few people anywhere, whether in the United States or elsewhere, that fall into that category. So I'm honored that she's joined us this morning, and I want to let you know actually that I've known her for a long time. I started as a lawyer for the Palestinian negotiating team in 2000. At that time, there were a handful of people that were the go-to people that you went to no matter what the idea was that you were discussing, no matter what the negotiation was. There was always somebody who made the time to talk to you about it. There was always somebody who made the time, regardless of whether she was going to be in the meeting or not, to weigh in on the proposal or to give her own ideas and to be very proactive about ideas about what needed to happen. And that was, of course, Dr. Ashrawi. Now, you'll know a little bit about her bio, but everybody here must know that she just recently got elected to the PLO Executive Committee. This is the first time the PLO Executive Committee has had an election for its members. They've been appointed in the past. So this is a first time. And she's also the first woman to have been appointed to be elected to the PLO Executive Committee. Mm-hmm. So it's a very important...
Wasn't easy.
And just so you understand where the PLO versus the PAs, because there's one in Gaza and one in the West Bank, to understand where the PLO falls in this context, the PLO is considered the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. That's the Palestinian people everywhere. They are the ones with the legal mandate to negotiate with Israel. The Palestinian Authority has no legal mandate. The Palestinian Authority was created by the Oslo Agreement to administer areas of the occupation on behalf of Israel, until conclusion of the occupation and the creation of a Palestinian state. So the Palestinian Authority has responsibility for administering Areas A primarily of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. The PLO has the responsibility for negotiating with Israel and with the international community. The Executive Committee of the PLO is the body that's going to be overseeing those negotiations that President Obama has so ardently put forward in the last couple of days. She's also been elected to the Palestinian Legislative Council of the Palestinian Authority, so she's had both hats. And she's also set up a number of international human rights NGOs as well as Palestinian NGOs that have worked on human rights, including Miftah, the Palestinian Initiative for the Promotion of Global Dialogue and Democracy. She's won the Sydney Peace Prize. She's also founder and chair of the Executive Committee of the Coalition for Accountability and Integrity and Transparency International. She also had a responsibility with the Arab League to be the Commissioner of Information and Public Policy for a while. And she's, on top of that, there was one other thing I wanted to mention. You were, of course, the Minister of Higher Education and Research. And this is actually remarkably important when you can...
One thing you missed that I like. Yeah. We have the first ombudsman organization in the Arab world in Palestine, which is called the Palestinian Independent Commission for Citizens' Rights, and that has become the Palestinian Independent Commission for Human Rights, and it was recognized globally as the ombudsman organization. And okay, and it's mandated by law, so that's the one thing I'm really insistent on mentioning.
Now, this begs the question, of course, of what Dr. Ashrawi does in her free time.
I'm a grandmother.
And for those of you who know her daughter, you know that her daughter is also following in her mom's footsteps. So let's just get started. So what's the latest thing that everybody's really interested in? It's the scorekeeping, right? This is Washington, D.C., and we're interested in who won any political debate or any political fight and who lost. And the debate that's been going on in Washington this last week is, has Bibi Netanyahu won? Did he beat Obama by not agreeing to a settlement freeze? Or did he lose by having the president so ardently articulate that permanent status negotiations on the 5 core permanent status issues would begin, and that a comprehensive peace agreement would be the goal of it? In the 2 narratives that are being discussed, however, in Washington, the assumption has been that the Palestinians lost, regardless of which scenario you're talking about. So regardless of whether you think Obama won or whether you think Bibi won, you also think the Palestinians didn't win. But there hasn't been a Palestinian to talk to us about it, so I thought maybe you could give us...
They should have.
Yeah, they should have. But
yes.
Maybe you could tell
That's
us
the
something.
problem. They keep missing presenting the narrative directly. I mean, while talking, while in New York, while having these meetings, they should have been out there saying exactly what's happening. I don't believe in hiding things. Transparency is important even in politics. But it depends on where you stand, who lost and who won, according to whom, according to what constituency and what audience. To the Palestinians, the Palestinian people, and I did meet with Abu Mazen before he came, and we did have long talks also with people who were meeting, that it's very important that the Palestinians not be seen to give in, that the leadership not constantly be seen as the point of least resistance as usual. When the Americans are faced with a brick wall called Israeli, sort of arrogance or intransigence or refusal to cooperate, they shouldn't turn around and say, okay, now, in order to help us with our constituency, please be flexible and accept compromise solutions and so on. So there was a public as well as an official position that we cannot afford this anymore. That this tactic, this approach to the Palestinians has cost the Palestinian leadership a great deal with its constituency. Credibility, a sense of consistency. People feel that anyway they try to detach the leadership from the people, and they treat the Palestinians as though they have no constituency, as all you need to do is persuade the top guy to say something, and that's fine, and there's no price to be paid. This is very serious. This approach has to stop. The Palestinians do have accountability. We have a very, very active, intrusive, critical public opinion. So when you look at Palestinian public opinion, the more you force the leadership to self-negate, the more you weaken the people who are supposedly committed to peace. And even the intelligent Israelis know that. The ideological Israelis think that all you have to do is squeeze the Palestinians more, and that's it. And it doesn't happen. It just doesn't produce results. So the trilateral meeting was seen as a photo op, without much substance. It was seen that the Mitchell mission did not succeed. It failed. And therefore, in order not to say it's a failure, and in order to try to appeal to Netanyahu and his demands, they did have the trilateral meeting. So in that sense, yes. It was seen as more of the same. It was seen as, again, accepting Israeli sort of hardline politics and transitions, especially when on the ground you still have settlement activities. Netanyahu talked about reduction of settlements, and instead of reducing the 2,000, settlements per year, they're already building 6,000 to 7,000 if you look at the statistics. So the reduction is an increase, and there is no freeze, so to speak. And at the same time, Jerusalem is taken out of the equation. Public buildings are still being built. Settlements are still expanding, whether vertically or horizontally, I don't care. They're still expanding. And this has become extremely serious because this is seen as the test, finally, once and for all. The irreconcilables have to be defined as such. So that trilateral meeting was seen as all show, no substance, catering to Netanyahu. On the other hand, people are amazed that the US administration, somebody like Obama, who's very forthright and outspoken and so on, would actually accept to play the game that way with somebody like Netanyahu, who's been thumbing his nose, at the American administration, who's been saying, you can say whatever you want, I'll do whatever you want, and you still have. Is this a repetition of the sort of Clinton run-in between Netanyahu and this administration, particularly given the fact that he's running an extreme right-wing coalition? We're talking about this is not even a regular Likud right-wing, because the Likud peace camp is Kadima, and Likud itself has gone more to the right and has gone to bed with people like Lieberman and so on, and co-opted, of course, Barak. So it was seen as such, but with a great deal of surprise. Now, what helped, as you mentioned, was the fact that I'm so sorry. I should have done this before. The fact that President Obama made a very clear speech afterwards, the UNGA speech. That is a redeeming factor, because that speech articulates or frames the major issues. It stood up to Netanyahu on issues of permanent settlement by saying these are the issues. And it stood up to Netanyahu on the illegitimacy of the settlements, even though he didn't say outright that they all have to stop, they are all illegal and so on. He, of course, reiterated the two-state solution. He mentioned the occupation, which is a Bush formulation. The occupation that began in '67 must stop. And, of course, he stressed the comprehensive approach to peacemaking. So in some ways, he's salvaging the policy, the strategy, the public commitment. The real question remains. He makes all the right noises. Can he make the right moves? Which was the first question when he was appointed, and he talked about foreign policy priorities and the Middle East being a priority. So now he's facing another test. Mahmoud Abbas is facing another test. The PLO is facing a major test. Netanyahu is going to go home and claim, you see, I stood up to the Americans, I maintained my position, I built more settlements, I took Jerusalem out of the equation, and so on and so on. And there was nothing to be paid. Is this policy going to continue? That's the real question. Can Israel constantly be the tail wagging the dog? And can it constantly decide or impose its will on how things are going to proceed in the Middle East? Not just for the Palestinians, we're under occupation, they've been bashing us, but for the American administration. That's the real test.
Well, just to follow up on that, when President Abbas goes home, does he go home to, we already heard the Ismail Haniya and the khutbah and the speech on Friday prayers last Friday already blasted him for coming to the talks and saying, well, see, that's what you get for this kind of negotiation process. Yeah. Does this weaken, when Abbas goes back, is he weakened with Fatah or is he strengthened with Fatah?
No, he's
as a
weakened
result?
with Fatah, certainly. They had, as you know, last month there was the Fatah Revolutionary Council meeting, the Fatah Congress, and they elected the new Revolutionary Council and the new Central Committee. And they did a good job in the sense, relatively, given the conditions, in the sense that in the Revolutionary Council, the younger generation at least became active and recognized and decisive, and they were elected. Even in the Central Committee, despite the fact that not a single woman was elected there, right. But still, they will appoint one, but still, they should have done their mea culpa, and they should have done more democratization and so on. It's okay. So he felt empowered. He felt empowered by the Fatah base. And the Fatah political message was stand firm. Fatah has always been the majority in the national camp. It has been at the forefront of the revolution, at the forefront of negotiations. So they're the ones who change pace or change direction or course. And his base is telling him that you have to stand firm, that you cannot anymore play the game of a process for its own stake, photo ops, you know, sort of atmospherics, symbolism, and so on. We need to see that the Americans need business because they paid the price. Fatah, the election of Hamas was largely due not just to Hamas and what it did, but to the fact that Fatah could not deliver. They staked everything on peace. From the president on down, they worked on one peace process after the other. It was prolonged. They could not deliver. They were seen as losing power and credibility. And they took Hamas down. They took Fatah down with them. So now they're saying, no, we need to re-energize, and we need you to be there to represent us in a very powerful way and stand firm. So when he goes back, he's not going to find the base as a whole saying, well, you did a great thing, because when he left, people were telling him, unless you get a settlement freeze, don't have a symbolic meeting, because we pay the price again. So that has cost him. And even there's, I think it was Akiva Eldar or Nahum Barnea or somebody who wrote that this is very short-sighted and stupid because it's making the Israelis lose a partner for peace. The more they weaken Abu Mazen with these things, the worse it is for everybody who wants peace.
So what would need to happen to flip that? What would your advice be if you were sitting with Senator Mitchell and President Obama and Secretary of State Clinton? What advice would you give them in order to reverse that or flip that?
Several things, I think, not just with Fatah, but with the Palestinians, with the Arab world, maybe even with the world. One cannot keep playing with smoke and mirrors and so on, or veils and mirrors even. One has to say, this is it. If Mitchell could not deliver what he was supposed to deliver, he has to come out and say so. The sort of veiled statements like, well, we're very close on many issues. And I said this is not a question of numbers, numerical issues. You could be close on 99% of the issues, and the one issue of the occupation or settlements you're not close on, that's it. They offered us 35 administrative jobs under occupation. Totally meaningless. We needed the one thing, freedom. So it's not numerical. We need to have a very clear public diplomacy in terms of conveying the facts, because the Palestinians and the Arabs know what's happening. So Mitchell should have stood up and said, I could not get from the Israelis what was needed, because there was a very clear public message from the president saying all settlements are illegal, dating back even to the first Mitchell report when he said all settlements have to stop, including growth, natural growth, and so on. So they cannot be seen to backtrack, and they shouldn't.
But they haven't backtracked. They haven't said in any way that they didn't give in on settlements in Jerusalem or natural growth or anything. They just didn't get it.
They didn't get it, so what? So they say, I'm sorry, the Israelis don't listen to us, so there's nothing we can do about it, and let's go and see what we can get out of the Palestinians. They even contrived the issue of incitement, because there's no incitement anywhere. I mean, the issue is you had a mission, the mission didn't work, come out and say, I failed, and why? Why that mission? Now, is there a price to be paid if you refuse to cooperate? Look, that reminds me, I don't want to go off on a digression or a tangent. It reminds me of what happened when For decades, we've been saying Israel has been violating international law. Israel is an occupying power. Is there any kind of accountability? Legal, judicial, global accountability? Do you hold countries accountable when they violate international law? And everybody said no. And then the Palestinians, under occupation, elected Hamas for a variety of reasons. Not that I'm happy with it, but they did. So they were boycotted. And so they suddenly, overnight, found themselves under sanctions. And that certainly blew people's minds. How come? You know, Israel violated the law and got away with it. Nobody ever used the term sanctions in relation to Israel. And the Palestinians, under occupation, elected Hamas, and they were under sanctions. And they couldn't understand that. How come it's always the Palestinians who get punished? And now they got punished for a democratic exercise. In this case, it's the same thing. Historically in the peace process, and I've been there since the beginning. That's why I'm saying not more of the same, we've had it. You cannot continue to go to the weaker side and say, we need concessions because there are elections in Israel. We need concessions because the Israelis need to keep their coalition together. We need concessions because there's a new American administration and it needs to look good and to try to deliver. We've paid the price for American elections repeatedly. I remember all the presidents who were involved in the peace process. And we paid the price for careers being made or broken in relation to the peace process, for individuals who made talks their own career and an objective unto themselves. Let's talk and talk and talk. In the meantime, nothing is checked on the ground. That's why we're in this position now, where people are saying no more talks. Either you stop the settlements and begin dismantlement, not just even freeze. People at home don't like the term freeze, because when you thaw something that is frozen, it is reactivated. It means it's okay that you just froze it. But people are saying settlements are illegal, they should stop. And to show that you're committed, you should begin to dismantle the settlements. And not just that, but they're antithetical. Not just linguistically, but they're antithetical in terms of what you hope to achieve. If you are talking about a two-state solution with 67 boundaries, the lines are being blurred, are being erased by the settlements, and the land is no longer available for a Palestinian state that is, as Obama said, that is contiguous, that is viable, and so on and so on. So are you going to stop those issues that are making your vision impossible, and are you going to hold people accountable who are not only not cooperating, but who are defying and flouting international?
Okay, but now the president has said, okay, I haven't gotten this. I'm still going to keep on insisting on it, but we need to go to permanent status negotiations. I don't want to spend, and now I'm paraphrasing, of course, I don't want to spend another 5 months negotiating settlement freeze.
You should negotiate. You don't have to.
Right. So
why should you negotiate an illegality? You stop it or else.
Okay, so do you think the Palestinians, in this imperfect situation, in this imperfect world, do you think the Palestinians would be in a position to be able to go to permanent status negotiations while the United States is still insisting on a settlement freeze but not getting it, or a halt to settlement activity?
No. I may be very blunt. I'm sorry. I'll tell you why. Because if the Americans cannot get a so-called settlement freeze from the Israelis, how can they get a peace agreement? How can they guarantee anything? I mean, this affects the credibility of the U.S. directly. If you cannot get the Israeli government to stop settlements, you can't get them to do anything. Then we will enter a whole new cycle of talks for their own sake, while we lose more land, more rights, more lives, more resources.
There's been an
That's
argument.
the issue. Let's
So
not talk
back.
more. Let's do things.
Okay, well, let me push back and play devil's advocate. So somebody
That's
else...
your job, yeah.
Yeah, so somebody would argue, somebody in Washington would argue, the president has to expend X amount of political capital in order to get Israel to do Y. He can spend that political capital to get Israel to do the settlement freeze, but then he's lost that capital. Or he can spend that capital to get the state, the Palestinian state. He can spend it all in December after 3 months or 4 months of negotiations on final status, or he can try to expend it now and then go into negotiations. How do you respond to that argument?
My argument is that if he holds off till he gets to permanent status talks and he manages to get an agreement and to implement the agreement, there will be no state to be had. That's it. Because what's happening now is eradicating the very foundation, the basis of the Palestinian state. And it's happening so quickly. If you're there, if you're on the ground, and I'm sure you've been there often,
Yes.
you're seeing not just the wall come up, you're seeing the land being taken, the settlements expanding, the apartheid roads, the bypass roads, they're just destroying, they're superimposing, once again, in a very systematic way, a grid, roads, electricity, water, etc., and a demographic, plus all these settlements that are growing and becoming cities. And pretty soon there's nothing left. I don't see how. Nowadays, many people, particularly Palestinians outside Palestine, but some within, who are saying that it's already not viable. There's no way in which we can have a two-state solution with what's happening on the ground, so let's go for a one-state solution. And I believe then that would perpetuate the conflict. But to go back to the president, he has capital, he made the commitment, he issued statements, he appointed his envoy, he appointed the team. Maybe now he needs to diagnose, maybe he needs to work with his allies, and he needs to see where the U.S. cannot work at it alone. And where, if there are domestic constraints, which is a polite way of saying that there's a very powerful lobby and so on and so on. I don't want to go beyond that. The domestic constraints can be countered with maybe international work, multilateralism. He is, after all, a multilateralist. One of the issues we discussed was go back to the UN, the Security Council. The quartet is there, a weird creature, but it is there. You can expand it. The Arab world is still there. You can work with it. So in a sense, you don't have to go at it alone. You have allies. There are people who see this as a vital necessity. And there are Americans. I believe there are Americans who understand that this is in the American national interest. It is at the heart of the American national interest. And what is costing the U.S. all its standing and credibility and so on is this constant blind support for Israel at the expense of peace, at the expense of justice, at the expense of legality, at the expense of American interests. I'm not here advocating U.S. interests. I'm advocating Palestinian Arab interests. But in this case, they coincide. If the U.S. wants to see stability, security, prosperity, good relations, if it wants to fight extremism and violence, if it wants to deal with issues like Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and so on, the connectivity is there. We are all a whole integrated, though not often peaceful, place. And if you solve core issues, the neocon agenda proved itself to be wrong, but if you solve core issues, the political issues, issues of grievances and injustice that extremism feeds on, then this is your key to the region.
One last point on this subject, and we'll go on to something else. Let's say the president heard what you said and said, okay, well, I can't actually get Israel to agree to what I want them to do right now, but I still want permanent status negotiations. So there will be a punishment. There will be a cost to pay. The United States will find a way to physically show that it's withdrawing its support for the settlement enterprise in the occupied territory, but I want permanent status negotiations. Mm-hmm. Would that be enough for the Palestinians to have the United States beginning to show tangible physical signs of withdrawal of its support for the occupation, for the maintenance of the occupation?
That certainly would help. I remember when the Bush administration, George Herbert Walker Bush and Baker decided that the settlement, that they linked the loan guarantees, the 10 billion loan guarantees to the settlements, that sent a clear statement that we mean business, not only to the Israelis but to the Arab world. Now you have the Goldstone report. Now you have all sorts of other things. You can say we will lift the cover because the U.S. gives Israel an automatic cover at the UN Security Council and the veto and so on. So we lift the cover. And we will come out. Part of the strategic alliance with Israel is nothing goes to the UN. The UN doesn't take decisions that would sanction or that would criticize Israel. The U.S. would use its veto powers. The U.S. would never stop its support for Israel, financial and otherwise, and so on. And now you have the Goldstone report. The U.S. can say, well, it's an international report, and it's a UN report, and it can be pursued. Why should the U.S. constantly pull Israel's chestnuts out of the fire for it? There are so many ways in which the U.S. can send a clear message that we mean business, and without saying jeopardizing its relationship. Because I tell you what, if you go to bed with the extremists, you destroy the chances of peace for the majority of Israelis as well, not just the Palestinians. There are many Israelis who are very critical of the position, the policies of Netanyahu, and of the fact that Netanyahu can be seen to once again try to coerce the Americans to live, if not accept, live with his decisions. Because Netanyahu's positions do not reflect the positions of those who want peace. Even Kadima is not there, and Labour and so on. He is, in a way, catering to the extreme ideological right, including the Liebermans of the world and the religious right and so on. So if you allow him to get away with it, you're strengthening the anti-peace camp, you're strengthening the extremist camp in Israel, and you really are undermining the peace camp in Israel, as well as the Palestinians and the Arabs. And the Palestinians certainly have tried very hard to deliver and to give Obama the chance to be the peacemaker. But he also has to go a bit of the way to show that he can stand up. And there are many ways, as we said. You can go to the UN, the Security Council, you can go to your allies, you can have, if you want a multilateral international meeting and approach, you can articulate the end game very clearly and say this is it, there's a time frame, this is what needs to be done, and it is a global endeavor.
So that's a good segue then. Let's assume the president does that. Mm-hmm. And the Palestinians agree then. We trust the president. He's shown his commitment. We'll go into the permanent status negotiations. We believe he's serious about ending this conflict. Ehud Barak has already been here a number of times to pitch a state with provisional borders. Mm-hmm. Some of David Makovsky, a friend of mine, has been pitching an idea that's been written about in some of the Jewish press about a borders first model in which there would be a resolution on the borders not including Jerusalem of a Palestinian state, because the existential issues of refugees and Jerusalem are difficult, and so you need to have some progress, and that's what you could have for the next 5-10 years. And then, mechanisms. I believe David, actually, if David were here, he would argue, but there need to be mechanisms on how to resolve the other issues, the Jerusalem issue and the refugee issue. And then, of course, there's the default comprehensive agreement solution, which is Clinton parameters, Taba, Geneva, something along those lines. Yeah. So we know what Ehud Barak thinks. Netanyahu has been fairly consistent in explaining the reservation model that he supports.
The population centers.
The happy population centers, the theme parks, the Palestinian theme parks. And the...
let them eat cake.
Let them eat cake. And we heard from the president, and actually we heard from the president very specifically that what he wants is the time has come to relaunch negotiations without preconditions that address the permanent status issues: security for Israelis and Palestinians, borders, refugees, and Jerusalem. The goal is clear: 2 states living side by side in peace and security, a Jewish state of Israel with true security for all Israelis, and a viable independent Palestinian state with contiguous territory that ends the occupation that began in 1967 and realizes the potential of the Palestinian people. Mm-hmm. So it sounds like he's weighing in on the comprehensive side. What's the Palestinian...
I said he made the right noises. I mean, what he's saying is what can be done, what should be done. Comprehensive, permanent status issues, quickly, with a time frame, and he defined the Palestinian state, the occupation of 67, and so on. Now, the question of a Jewish state is something else. I mean, he's willing to say it. There are many people who aren't, but that's another issue. The issue with people like Barak, not Barack Obama, Ehud Barak, is that he keeps modifying his approach depending on what's convenient. If you start picking out of the roadmap the middle part, excluding the first and the last part, you're in serious trouble. And the middle part is the only optional part. when it comes to the Palestinians, the international community waxes creative. Start thinking of ways of redefining sovereignty, of redefining state. We're the only state with provisional borders, so to speak, and we're not even a state. How can you? I mean, unless you want to become an Israel and define your state as you go along, maybe if you have a strong army, you can occupy other people's lands. But the thing is, you do need to define borders, but you cannot talk about borders as being provisional. You cannot talk about a provisional state. You cannot talk about transitions again, because in our experience, everything that's transitional with Israel has become permanent. They use it and they build on it. So the Palestinian position has been very clear. We implemented the first phase of the roadmap on issues of security and issues of even building institutions and empowerment and so on. And it's time to move quickly to the third phase. The second phase was optional. We don't have time and we don't have the ability to cope with another transition. It's finished. Transitions are counterproductive because they undermine permanent status. Everybody knows what is needed. Move to permanent status quickly. The third phase is there. You need, of course, every timeline, every schedule, every time frame that has been discussed has been violated. But now people have to mean business. So we're not willing to go into either a virtual state. Remember Tzipi Livni and Olmert, and they talked about virtual states, shelf agreements, transitional agreements, postponing major issues, and so on. Our problem is that within the peace process, from the beginning, when you postpone the core issues, you allow the powerful party to prejudge them, to preempt them, which is what happened systematically. That's why the settlements have become the acid test now. Everything has been preempted that has been postponed. The boundaries, the land, the settlements, Jerusalem. Jerusalem is besieged. The wall, the settlements, the checkpoints, totally extracted. And the IDs are being confiscated. Palestinians, even demographically, are losing their rights and their presence in Jerusalem. The character of Jerusalem is changing. Everything is changing. Everything that has been postponed has been preempted and prejudiced. So we're saying, okay, we have a limited time frame, move quickly. If you start pulling out bits and pieces here and there, if you go to CBMs, confidence building measures, not missiles. Confidence building measures have been really the bane of the peace process, because you cannot wait until every single Palestinian trusts every last Israeli and vice versa. It's not. I mean, Israel has an endless reservoir of violations to do to the Palestinians. They're the occupying power, we're not. So, I mean, they can always do confidence, lift a few checkpoints and demand a price in return, right? We don't have anything to give, frankly. So CBMs don't work. It's not that we need to build confidence, it's that we need to have a solution that will generate new realities that will generate confidence.
But are the Palestinians...
So that's one thing. Sorry.
But are the Palestinians presenting, or do they already have ideas on what a comprehensive peace agreement actually looks like that they're sharing with the Americans? If at some point the United States is going to have to intervene, if it's going to have to say, okay, the Israeli position is over here, the Palestinian position is over here, and we're going to have to present something. Now, the Israelis have been busy providing the Americans with lots and lots of ideas on what the gap should be, how the gap should be filled. Are the Palestinians, do they have ideas on what should happen with refugees, what should happen with Jerusalem, what should happen with land swaps? And are they sharing them with the administration, or are they holding them in reserve, or...
The problem is that the Israelis constantly find ways of filling in, of coming up with ideas. That's true. And because there's such, it's not even a gap, that they can take you all the way down to side roads and digressions and other issues, as we said, and not deal with permanent status issues. And they can find ways of saying, okay, we'll lift checkpoints, we'll make life a bit easier, we'll go down the economic peace road, we'll do all these things, and peace for peace, and prosperity will produce, good feelings, and so we can always do that, but we are the aggrieved party. We're on the receiving end. We don't have time to start proposing all these, nice cosmetic changes that the Israelis can propose forever. They do have the ability and the time and the space, because they can use that time and space to create facts and to go on tangents and digressions and cosmetic changes and CBMs and whatever they want. What we're saying is that this is our life. We're losing people in Jerusalem. We're losing land in and around Jerusalem. The character of Jerusalem has changed. We're losing our livelihood. We're losing the siege in Gaza is disastrous. The suffering is enormous. We need to stop it. The land is being lost, so the Palestinian state is disappearing. The sense of urgency that we have, and the exact opposite that the Israelis have, which is let's buy more time, which they've done. We started talking about peace in 88, not even 91, even before that, when Schultz came to the region. So lots of talks have taken place and lots of digressions and lots of proposals. The problem is the Palestinians are saying we can't afford more a process for its own sake, more talks. Let's see actions. And the actions involve the settlements, lifting the siege, stopping the wall, the siege of Jerusalem, and so on. These are crucial issues, and as well as the internal siege and fragmentation and checkpoints. Now, historically, I would say very plainly that the Palestinians have not come up with their own narrative or version, even public narrative, PR. We are the weaker side, and at the same time, we haven't been able to present our position in a way as to gain the support of the public.
Isn't part of this a matter of will? I mean, it's not as if there's a lack. Well, the weakness part, I mean, jiu-jitsu, you know, you take the weakness of your own weakness, you turn it against your opponent. You take their strength and you turn it against them.
Your weakness has to be used positively.
You have to use it in a positive way. Now, the Palestinians can easily be presenting their position. There's nothing that prevents them from presenting their position in the United States. There's nothing that prevents them from reaching out to Congress or speaking directly to the American public and presenting what a comprehensive peace agreement would look like, or what Jerusalem would be an example, for example. The Israelis say we mustn't divide Jerusalem, but the Palestinian position has been
67 boundaries.
67 boundaries.
Yeah.
There hasn't been a way to describe, or I haven't heard Palestinians in America describing to the American public, and particularly to the evangelical community, for example, that would be very interested in this, how Jerusalem what would Jerusalem look like under a peace deal, under a comprehensive peace agreement? How would Jerusalem be handled? What are the Palestinian... The default position on the Palestinian side seems to be to wait until somebody presents them with a plan.
And react to it.
And then they will react to it and say, this isn't good enough. And instead of saying, you know what, this is the plan that I would like, and then let the Americans or let the Israelis come to them and say, that's not good enough.
Yeah.
But then you set the terms of the debate. Now, that seems to be there's nothing that, I mean, I have met remarkable Palestinians that I think you're one of, but I don't think that there's any shortage of Palestinians who could do this, but they're not doing it. So it doesn't seem to me that this is an Israeli... This is not because Israel is preventing it from happening. This is because the Palestinians are preventing it from happening.
No, you're right. This is the main difference. I think you remember way back when we were negotiating in Washington, before the DOP. Our approach was that we take the initiative. We present the papers. Negotiations should be on the basis of the Palestinian documents and vision and so on, and not to be in a reactive mode, reacting to the Israeli papers. That was our approach, and we started with the core issues. We started with Jerusalem. Of course, we considered the settlements as illegal and they have to go, and the boundaries have to be respected, 67 and so on, and human rights. That was a major concern of ours, democracy and human rights. Now, I don't want to go back just to start a diagnostic exercise on why things went wrong. It's precisely because the peace process, in a sense, was hijacked. Israel took the initiative. The Americans adopted the approach and the American peace team, that all you need to do is solve the minor issues and the big issues, postpone them till the end. And our approach was exactly the opposite. Solve the big issues, the minor technical issues will fall in place. There's no sense in postponing the big issues. And they're the ones that are keys to the solution. They're the ones that are being prejudged. So we had exactly the opposite, and your approach is the right approach. Let's go straight to the key issues, and let's solve them. The minor technical, functional issues will be solved very easily then. But you can't pat yourself on the back every time you give the Palestinians a small function or you give them, or you remove a checkpoint. That's not what negotiations is all about. So since then, I think we made serious mistakes in not regaining the initiative, and not attempting to have our positions out there, and not attempting to have our discourse, our language, be the decisive language, and in not presenting our case on the Hill and to the public and in op-ed and so on. This is part of the problem within first of all, the Palestinian political system. And it's not the only problem. We've had other problems. For heaven's sake, we've been through a civil war almost, and we are fragmented and divided, and now we're trying to undo that damage. Of course, I can say we didn't have the means, we have the people, we have the know-how, but they're either not in position, or they're not empowered, or they're not given the support to do that. So there are many reasons, but I'm very, very candid about the fact that no, we haven't done our job well in terms of presenting our case instead of being there and engaging constantly. We have the NAD. I think we're the only people who do have a negotiation affairs department, as though it's part of life, permanent part of life. And then we have an NSU negotiation support unit, and then we have permanent negotiators, and so on. So it's as if it's our destiny to be negotiating forever. Negotiations is a means. It's supposed to be temporary. There's supposed to be an end to negotiate. So we have the professionals. But what we need to do is pull in people. That's why we need a new negotiations hire committee, and we're working on that. There were proposals about setting up a committee, about working out different approaches and negotiation strategies and so on. It's going to take a lot of doing, but I think it should be done, and we should present our point of view. We all do have ideas, but we should sit down and work them out and present them. The Palestinian narrative, I think, shouldn't wait. It shouldn't be subject to negotiations. The Palestinian point of view is consistent with international law, for example. It's consistent with justice. So you do have this broad framework of legality and justice and the requirements of peace. Now, how do you translate that into steps and strategies? That's the real issue. And the narrative as a human narrative, as a narrative of justice, should be there all the time, in the newspapers, on TV, on the Hill, and so on. And the absence is inexcusable. But the negotiating strategies are different. And they should be done in a professional way in order to be picked up and to become the backbone of the process. Now we're saying we need a time frame, we're saying we need concrete steps, we're saying simultaneously you don't enter into side issues, technical issues, and so on, and transitional phases, and we know why. But how do you tackle all these issues? Now we are in agreement with Obama on the comprehensive nature, both within Palestine in addressing the permanent status issues, and within the Arab world and region on bringing in Syria and Lebanon and so on to the table. So that at least is something that we can work with.
Okay, one last question before I open it up to everybody, which is the part that nobody talks about. The quartet statement that came out yesterday simply repeated what the previous quartet statements had said. Although they, I think, adopted maybe some of the language that President Obama is now using. On Gaza and the question of Palestinian unity, one of the talking points for the Israeli embassy and one of the talking points for the Israeli side is, we'd love to make peace. Abu Mazen's a nice guy. Salam Fayyad's a great guy. But they don't really represent the majority of Palestinians. So even if we cut a deal with them, they won't be able to speak on behalf of all Palestinians. At the same time, of course, everybody knows that the moment Hamas is part of a Palestinian government, Israel would say we can't make peace with a government that includes Hamas. The question is from the Palestinian side.
Yeah.
In my conversations with some people from inside Fatah, seems to indicate that there's no urgency to resolving the split between the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, that somehow a peace deal can actually even maybe be had while the split is still in place, and then after a state is created, the Gazans will come to their senses and fall in step.
There are different
happening?
schools of thought on that. I believe that it's important that we reconcile our differences. I think it's important that Gaza and the West Bank manage to rejoin, not through a deal of divvying up the spoils or who's in power or how many people in the security do you have and how many do I have, but through trying to depoliticize the security, for example, in a genuine reform approach, trying to work with the PLO to expand it in order to have it be fully representative. I think that the democratic system is the only way in which we can function. And, of course, a peace deal, it's logical, would help the nationalists, would help Fatah and the PLO factions and everybody in the peace camp and so on in Palestine, and would, in a sense, prove to Hamas and others that going down the peace path can produce results. So far, Hamas has been strengthened by the fact that going down the peace path produces more suffering, more pain, more loss of land. And they blame us for it, actually. So I think that the division should not be a problem for the Israelis. For decades, they've had one government, one leader even, one address. Right. And Arafat was willing to deliver. And they didn't make peace. So it's not the question that the Palestinians didn't have one address or were not united or did not have a strong leadership. They did. And they didn't come to any agreement with them. Two, everybody has committed on paper in writing that the PLO is the address for negotiations. Hamas, in the document of national reconciliation, agreed that the PLO should negotiate on behalf of all the Palestinians. And dating back to the Cairo Agreement of 2005, we've all agreed that the PLO should be expanded and should be more democratized and so on, and reformed, and would include Hamas and Jihad. So, and that's not an Israeli problem. They have the PLO, they have the address, they're willing to talk. How we deal with this internally we can resolve. And it's very clear that now the Arabs are on board, particularly the Egyptians, of course, but the Arabs have delegated the Egyptians to work with the Palestinians to try to come up with an agreement. See, in the latest document, it's more technical than substantive, but still, there are serious attempts at trying to bring about a Palestinian reconciliation. It's very important, but the reconciliation has to be done in the right way, on the right foundations for the right objectives, because it is our own empowerment. Right now the division is weakening us, yes. Right now we have two different political systems and they're tainting and the elections, of course, were tainted by the occupation, but they're tainting our own political system and social systems. Because you have a sort of monolithic repressive system in Gaza, which I certainly don't agree with when it comes to human rights and fundamental freedoms. And you do have in the West Bank also certain violations for fear that the military takeover of Gaza would spill over into the West Bank. But and Hamas in many ways has really become extremely flexible and moderate in its political agenda because it wants to be recognized, it wants to stay in place. And one way to do that is to accept the fact that you need a Palestinian democracy that would include Hamas, Jihad, and all the different factions of the PLO and all the representative bodies, and should help the Palestinians carry out national elections. The only way to resolve this ultimately is by having elections. You cannot, nobody is going to win over the other by either force of arms or coercion or pressure. It has to be elections, and it has to be also elections for the PLO and the institutions of the PLO, including the PNC. And that's how you can have a sort of national address that is reformed and reactivated and empowered. Which is one reason why I accepted to be in the executive, because I think now is the time to take serious decisions at the national level.
Thank you. Okay, let's try to take some questions from the floor, and I'll ask you to introduce yourself and to state your affiliation. John, just right next to you.
Hi, Steve Kribner from J Street. Dr. Ashrawi, thank you for being with us this afternoon. Thank you for sharing your insights.
Thank you,
and
Steve.
for your continued commitment to the peace process.
Let's hope to peace. We've had enough process.
Yes, we have. My question is this. It seems that time is working against the two-state solution. It's working against Israelis who want a two-state solution. It's working against Palestinians who want a two-state solution. It's working against Americans who want a two-state solution.
That's true.
And therefore, it's working in favor of a potential one-state solution or continued violence. My question is, within the Palestinian society, particularly in the West Bank, can you articulate a bit where the Palestinian political will is for a two-state solution, if it is indeed waning, and how to deal with that, and what kind of threat that poses to the two-state solution? Thank you.
Yeah. That's a good question, because the one-state solution had very few takers in the West Bank and Gaza because people want to be free. People want to end the occupation. My position is let's end the occupation, let's exercise our right to self-determination, and then we can decide how we want to re-engage, not just Israel but the whole region as equals. Now, people who talk about a one-state solution quite often don't understand all the damage that's being done. While we are under occupation, we're losing the land, we're being, I call it the deconstruction of Palestine, we're being dismantled, our national institutions are being dismantled, we're being transformed into these population centers or reservations or Bantustans, whatever. So the thing is, how do you empower yourself in order to make the two-state solution possible? One way is to stop the settlements, begin dismantling the settlements. Another way is what Salam Fayyad defined as the self-empowerment, as taking the initiative and building the Palestinian state from the bottom up, so to speak. This is a question of empowerment to maintain the Palestinians on the land, to build the state from inside out, even though we know Israel has the power to undermine that. But the latest polls show that about 30% of the Palestinians from Palestine, from the occupied territories, have now adopted the one-state solution, the one person, one vote. And I think if the impasse continues, if Israel is still allowed to continue with its unilateral policies on the ground and buying time to create facts and to destroy the two-state solution, then you're not going to have any takers de facto, because the possibility of a two-state solution is no longer there. And if you see the debate and the discussion and the Byzantine or Talmudic talks about the outposts, and I think all settlements are illegal, not just the outposts, you will see what happens if you're going to talk about Ma'ale Adumim, for example, or Gush Etzion, or Ariel, or Givat Ze'ev, or Pisgat Ze'ev, or any of these other settlements. So the question is, if there's a willingness now to make a clear divide, to stop the settlements and say we can rescue the two states, there is still a possibility. And we are, by the way, a vanishing breed. Very few people, especially outside Palestine, believe that it is still possible, even those who want the two-state solution, because I believe it's our right not to live under occupation. It's a legal, political issue of justice and humanity. It's not a demographic issue of who can have more children. That's not the issue to me. It's racist and sexist if it's just a demographic race. To me, it's an issue of we have the right to live on our own land in freedom. And we made the historical compromise by accepting the two-state solution, 22% of historical Palestine, side by side with Israel. So what's wrong with that solution? Now, if that disappears, then we are condemned to living under occupation for a while, for a long time, perpetuating the conflict, increase in violence, the use of the injustice to the Palestinians to increase instability, violence, and extremism outside, disenchantment with Israel again, and Israel is going to try to take the land without the people, which is an impossibility, and it's going to be very hard to swallow such a strong bite and a big bite. And it seems to me that Netanyahu is making a very strategic mistake in that sense, because if he wants an apartheid state, and it already is, I think, but it's becoming very clearly one which is much worse, an apartheid state that is in perpetual conflict, then he can go down that path. He can continue building more settlements, pandering to the extremists, bringing Jerusalem as, a sort of spiritual issue rather than a terrestrial city, not a celestial city. These things have to be addressed now. That's why I'm saying these policies are dangerous for everybody involved, and not just the Palestinians, not just the Israelis, the region as a whole. the different forces at work and at play in the region, who's strengthened and who's weakened, and at the same time for the credibility of the U.S. and the global rule of law.
John, right up to your right.
My name's Lee Diamond. I'm not a J Street spokesperson. I'm a supporter, and I know Amjad, and actually organized an event that I think you both spoke at an American university about 10 years ago.
I don't remember.
I'd like to make a suggestion,
Yeah.
which is that we need more of what J Street is doing, but we need more Palestinian dignitaries like you in the United States, because I like what you said about the international focus with the other parties, but the president needs help, and he can't afford to bypass American public opinion.
Mm.
So we need people like you who are will politely push our way into the Jewish establishment, synagogues, and so forth. And we also need to find partners for you in Israel, because I don't see much of a peace camp in Israel currently. And my friends email me their frustration and their anger and all that sort of thing. So, and maybe the president can send administration spokespeople to go with Palestinians and do a public tour of Israel or something. We have to change this, because Israel's not just going to change because of the politicians. It's going to have to come from the public, it seems to me.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. And I think there are lots of people who have been working for peace and with us for a long time. I feel absolutely frustrated with the politics of Israel and their inability to influence. It's amazing that they are unable, because the co-option of the Labour Party under Barak has really led to the weakening of a major portion of I won't say the Labour Party is the peace camp, but a major portion. And the others have been pushed, have been marginalized, and they really are not getting a hearing. They're labeled. And the more the right wing takes over in Israel, the more they label them as, the lunatic fringe, the extreme, and so on. And they're the people who used to be the center, who used to be the mainstream. That's why when you shift the whole political terrain to the right, the discourse shifts to the right, and you marginalize people who are working for peace. It's extremely serious. And I agree we need to work with public opinion, but it's not an exclusive. We have to do it while we're working on other things, while we're trying to bring about a solution, while we're trying to stop the damage from doing its job, because if it continues, then there'd be nothing to talk about. That's the problem. When reality supersedes the talks, which is what happened before, then the talks become irrelevant. And it's quite dangerous. This is a very dangerous situation. And you cannot allow the anti-peace forces to take over. In the States, you're right. We do need to have a common language. We do need to speak. That it is in the American interest. It's not against American interest. That it is in Israeli interest. It's in Palestinian interest. And the common language should be forged. Common terms of reference. A public discourse that is not exclusive. That is not absolutist. That does not claim, divine right and absolute right and so on. That says we have a shared vision that can become fact. This is how I think the current administration can be empowered. And I think that's why J Street is doing a good job, because it's saying nobody has the monopoly on the voice about Israel, for example, in the US. AIPAC for a long time had intimidated many people. And if you feel that that Israel is pluralistic and there are voices, and the pro-Israeli community is not just of one color, one approach, that would help. But again, I think it's the Palestinians also, and the Arabs, and even the Europeans, and like-minded people who understand the urgency and understand the topics, and understand the need to engage and to intervene positively, who should speak out, who should not be silenced, who should not be intimidated. I listened to Netanyahu's speech. I was insulted, frankly. I really was, because I've heard this before. It's so regressive. I mean, the language of absolutist ideology takes you back to the days even before the peace process, not even before during Netanyahu's earlier period and so on, when people substituted policy making and decision making and dealing with reality for a very transparent spin about how this is our land, the greatest, our homeland, and so on, and how we understand that some Palestinians live there. I mean, the whole mentality, the whole language, all this, just isn't up to par. It's as if it has skipped a few decades of history. And it's taking us back now to the language of exclusivity and ideology and negating the other, and quite an arrogant approach, I think. I found it very, it insults our intelligence. So what we need is intelligent discourse. And the speech by Obama, despite the fact that I'm very upset with him about the trilateral meeting, because I don't think it's useful at all. I think his speech is useful, but not a symbolic. Let's not go back to symbolics. We've paid the price of symbols before. Let's get to policy, let's get to actions. And if there are voices on all sides who are advocating this, and maybe if you have, why not have a bipartisan team in the US, for example, to help Obama? Because there are people on, not just bipartisan, but also people who are independents. I know there are not that many, but still. Experts, people who can contribute effectively. And you can make use of Palestinian and Israeli voices who also are speaking out. And J Street is doing a good job, and I think others should also speak out. There were others before J Street, but they were anyway smaller, and they didn't have the larger impact that they should have had.
Okay. I'm not trying to only pick on J Street participants. John, why don't you come on up to the front? Nadia, and then the gentleman in front.
Thanks very much. Nadia Hijab, Senior Fellow at the Institute for Palestine Studies. Hanan, I think one of the most hopeful things that you said was about Palestinians beginning to get their act together and to set limits to what they will accept. In that context, could you say a bit more about how the PLO might be reconstituted to really truly represent the Palestinian people, and what steps more about specific steps you might be taking now that you're on the committee? Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks. We already started. We do have a plan. At least we had several discussions. People presented their points of view, and then we're working on a joint plan for structural transformation, for the activation of departments, removal of some, addition of others, merging of others, for redefining the role of the PLO, for deciding on the time frame, but also the way in which the elections should take place for the PNC, which is very important, and of course for political decision making. The two political issues that we are dealing with are internal reconciliation and negotiations. And so we're setting up systems and structures for these two, for negotiations and for political reconciliation. We're setting we already have a preparatory committee for the PNC elections, and we are activating that and adding to it. And we're forming a new committee for negotiations. And also structurally, we have all sorts of things, proposed bylaws and institutional work and so on. And we're seeing how we can reach out to Palestinians outside Palestine. The problem is the neglect. When the PLO came into the occupied territories, it restricted its work, so to speak. It was subsumed willy-nilly by the PNA. It's like the child, sort of taking over the parent. Now we're saying no, that the Palestinians outside cannot be left, cannot be orphaned. You need to expand the work of the departments. You need to take care of the Palestinian refugee populations, the Palestinian expatriate communities. You need to revive a political address that is credible, that is solid. You need to work with them. That's why in reorganizing the departments, we are trying to see how we can work with all the Palestinian people outside, whether in refugee camps or even in the States. You're not in refugee camps, but you're expatriates as well. And it's important that there is a reference, that there is an address, and there's a common language that is spoken. The fragmentation. The problem is the internal division also reflected itself on the Palestinian communities outside Palestine. And it's important that we do regain some sort of cohesion within differences of opinion. People do not have to think alike. But isn't this democracy? Can't you find peaceful ways of expressing dissent, of not excluding the other, of working within a pluralistic, tolerant system? This is what I think we should establish, and we're working on, Nadia. I hope I answered some of it, but I'd be glad to share with you some more.
And if you could just tell people what the PNC is.
Sorry, the PNC is the Palestine National Council, which is the Palestine Parliament in exile. The PLC, which is the Palestine Legislative Council, is the part of the PNC. It's elected from the occupied territories. We are elected there, but we become members of the National Council, and the other members are representatives of General Union of Palestine Women, General Union of Palestine Students, of Palestine workers, health workers, professionals, and so on, as well as all the political parties and factions.
Hi, my name is Joe Guggenheim. I'm just a private citizen, a Jewish American sympathetic to the Palestinian problem. While I think everybody here was disappointed that President Obama could not get Netanyahu to agree to stop all settlements, nevertheless, I would still think it would be of the interest of the Palestinian cause at this point to proceed with the full status negotiations on all of the various points. In the past, I've been very disappointed in Israel when they had all sorts of preconditions to full status negotiations. Now, it seems to be on the other foot, if I understand the position correctly, where the PLO is now saying we will not negotiate the full range of issues until we can get an agreement on stopping all settlements. It seems to me that it makes sense for the Palestinian side to really engage on all issues at this point, particularly when you have somebody like Obama who's really committed to putting pressure on to get a good solution. And it seems to be in the Palestinian interest to continue to negotiate on all fronts, even though we were all disappointed about the stopping of the settlements.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think we're not placing any preconditions at all. What we're saying is if you have agreements like the roadmap and you're committed to them, you're not implementing them, what assures us that you will implement other agreements? If the U.S. cannot bring you to compliance on issues like the settlements now, how can they bring you to compliance on permanent status issues like Jerusalem and refugees? If the issue of settlements is not dealt with now, there's no sense in negotiating because there's no land left on which to build the Palestinian state. And we already have 500,000 Israelis on Palestinian territories, plus a lot of the land that was taken. So how can you allow one thing and its opposite to continue? That's the question. It's not preconditions at all. I know that's Israeli spin. They were saying preconditions. And I know that Netanyahu doesn't want to talk about permanent status issues at all. He just wants to continue to buy time and spin things and so on until he finishes with his settlement activities, which is what Shamir said years ago. And he said we were planning to prolong the talks for 10 more years and fill the West Bank with settlements so it becomes entirely meaningless to negotiate a withdrawal from the West Bank. And it seems to me this is exactly what's happening. They're filling the West Bank with settlements, with settlers, with people they're importing, they're bringing in, to the point where it becomes meaningless to negotiate. Now, what we're trying to do is save the negotiations and save the outcome, not put preconditions. If you allow them to continue, what they're doing unilaterally on the ground is what destroys the peace. I don't even want to talk about a process, because from our experience it's become a dirty word since the process has taken over and there's no peace and no relationship to reality. So we want a relationship to reality. You can talk about peace forever. It's like people who preach against sin and then go around and do everything they want in secret.
I have no idea
We're
what you're talking
tired of
about.
preaching. Yeah. And what we want is compliance. If you want people to believe you, act in a way which is consistent with your language. So
Behind you, right, John?
yes, please.
Well, we had one, and we'll get to more. We're not we're trying not to selectively discriminate against anyone.
Hi, Mitch Stoltz, also private citizen. Looking towards final status negotiations.
That's
What-
David, I
yeah.
didn't see you.
What needs to be done and by whom to avoid a repeat of the way that the 2001 final status negotiations ended?
That takes about an hour, I think, to begin to address. You're talking about the Camp David and the Taba talks and the Clinton parameters.
If you
and
can
all
do it
these.
in 1 minute, that would be better.
I will try. Well, one thing has been done which wasn't done then, which is begin from the beginning, not wait to the last minute. I mean, the Camp David problems was talks. The problem with them is that they started at the last minute with Clinton and with Barack seeing his coalition fall apart and Clinton needing a new legacy at the end of his term and all these things that they pushed for something that wasn't ripe already, and then they didn't even have a clear idea of what they wanted. They went on a fishing expedition on permanent status issues without sufficient preparation. The talks hadn't proceeded and so on. Now, at least you have a president who says, I'm going to start at the beginning. And he articulated the basics, okay, regardless. And he said, let's move. Now, can he put together a team different from the previous? The worst thing to do is to repeat the mistakes of the past. If people have been tried and have failed, you cannot keep pulling them up again and trying them again and failing again. You need a team that is credible, intelligent, fresh, and knows how to move quickly. And is trusted. And you need also to articulate foreign policy in a way that would gain multilateral support. European, Arab, go to the UN, and so on. I'm saying don't do it alone. Don't go at it alone. The US doing it alone meant that the whole peace process was subject to domestic issues. Work with others. And, of course, don't assume that the Palestinians are the weak side always and put pressure on the weak side. You have to have the backbone to stand up to Israel. And I tell you frankly, the Israeli public, when they see a leader who is strong and who knows where he's heading or she's heading, they will follow, whether it's to the right or the left. We've seen that with Rabin, and we've seen that with even with Sharon. So the question is to be decisive, to be clear, to know what the building blocks of peace are, and to begin on the ground quickly, rapidly, with a time frame that is binding, that's accepted by everybody, and have a partnership, have a multilateral. I used to facetiously say a coalition of the willing for peace this time. So maybe you can have that and move ahead. There are many things. I can sit down and give you all the required moves, but it's not up to me. The thing is to get these components in place and to move quickly, not to lose momentum, not to allow the process to take over, but to affect reality, to regain the constituency for peace, not to get into digressions, side issues, technical issues, transitional phases, and all these things and trimmings and cosmetics that we talked about. You have a very limited time frame. That's what's needed. And you have to regain the constituency everywhere.
I'm going to just take two more questions. I'm going to get to you, ma'am. But
yeah, we have Jim about 3 minutes.
Yeah, since I've got Jim in the front, I'm going to ask Jim and then you. And you'll be the last question. And one thing I wanted to say, though, just about that last comment of yours. Now, if all three sides, the Israelis, the Palestinians, and the Americans, decided that everybody who had been involved in the failed processes in the past were not involved, then they wouldn't really have, then they'd have to sort of start from isn't there a
then they should start from scratch, which is not a bad idea, frankly. People can read. Look, you don't need the person to be the historical memory. There are documents you can read. You know what's happening. And if somebody who's been heading the peace process, I don't want to give you his first initials, in the States, and I'm not going to talk about us, and who has failed repeatedly, you cannot, every time there's a new administration, pull him out and say, okay, now you do the same thing all over again. Khalas. You can have others, You can have intelligent people. And maybe sometimes you need to reinvent things. You cannot keep doing things the same way. You need to draw the proper conclusions. There are glaring mistakes that were made. And we can sit here and talk about them one after the other. I frankly am quite willing to relinquish my place to younger people, to people who have the willingness and the ability. And I can sit back and I can help if they need me. But you shouldn't have the same people all the time, especially if they failed. Especially. Failure has a way of perpetuating itself. Success is very important to regain confidence.
I have to say, though, I think that most Palestinians, at least, think of the tenure of the Madrid negotiations when you and Dr. Haidar al-Shafi, Ali Yarhamo, and others were involved in the
We
negotiations.
haven't failed, at least.
We're the successful, right? We're the successful part
Yeah.
of the negotiations, as opposed to those that.
I
took place
tend to
separately.
agree with you because we were doing things the right way, but we didn't continue. That's the problem. Is that another approach took over, and that was it. I mean, Haidar passed away, Faisal passed away. I'm the third of the triumvirate. I hope I don't pass away soon. But no, but we do have our documents. We do have a team. We worked with a team, but now you have something else. So when I mention people who failed, it's very clear. But also, there's another issue. No. The Israelis were good at this. And Arafat was good. Arafat used to think the messenger is the message. Whenever he sent X, he sent a message, I'm being conciliatory. Whenever he sent Y, he said, I'm being serious. Whenever he sent Z, he said, I don't want a deal. So people, because you know that the other side or other sides read your messengers, read your negotiators. And you shouldn't always have people who are so clear and obvious and repetitive and mundane and so on. No, you always need to change people. And psychologically, it's important to have new negotiators. Look, at one point, I remember in the Bush administration, they had, what's his name, who was always in the White House, who was the advisor of Sharon.
Dov Weizglass.
Yes, Dov Weizglass. I told Condi Rice at one point you should charge him rent. He spends more time in the White House than he does with Sharon. Really? And he's the one who wrote the April 4th speech, by the way. So, I mean, you have to change your people. You have to be able to re-engage. You have to be able to speak in a way that is rich and complex and not in a monotone and the same language all the time with the same people. And those who have failed should be changed. It's simple.
Hi, thank you. I'm John, and good to see you again, Hanan. My name is Jim Vitarello. I am the chairman of a new interfaith coalition in support of Obama called Yes We Can Middle East Peace. And we're going to be holding a major, let's call it event, at the historic Sinai Synagogue in early December. We're going to bring Israelis and Palestinians over here to speak and what have you, and to perform. But my question to you, Hanan, is this. Could you respond to an Israeli journalist, and I honestly can't remember his name, but it's really irrelevant, but I thought he made a fascinating proposal that Obama make a similar address to the Israeli people, as he did in Cairo to the Muslim and Arab people around the world, specifically laying out his vision to them and explaining why it's in their interest to have a two-state solution and peace with the Arab world, et cetera, et cetera. Go beyond just the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Explain to them the benefits of having peace with the entire Muslim and Arab world. What do you think about that, particularly in light of the fact Obama's standing in Israel now, I heard, is less than 10% in support of him, and Bibi's numbers have only gone up since the election. Given those statistics, which I've read many times, I assume they're correct, do you think that would be a good idea for Obama to, in effect, go over Bibi's head?
That's the thing. I mean, other presidents have done this. Sometimes you do need to go over the leader's head to reach the people with a clear message. Sometimes people say, well, when you give a message, everybody listens to it. It's not just when he speaks, when he spoke at the UN, Palestinians, Israelis, everybody heard it, and so on. But a direct address to the Israelis might not be a bad idea. A direct address to the way he did to the Arabs and to the Muslim world and so on. There's nothing wrong with that. And many people, I've read some of the articles about how the Israelis probably, all Israeli leaders, they said, needed a firm American hand. Because, and this was something that Rabin said, I need the Americans to be very firm, because this way I go to my constituency and say, our ally, our patron, our benefactor is telling us this, and we cannot do something or go against them. We cannot enter into. Now, for a long time, Netanyahu, Sharon, and others felt that they can. That they can, in a way, say. Sharon said openly, I'm not worried about Washington. I run Washington. He said, we have people who can decide on what happens in Washington. So this kind of mentality certainly is not conducive to any kind of conciliatory talks or any kind of serious address to the Israeli public. But if the American president wants to address the Israeli public with his, why not? Maybe he should. But I don't know how far that will go. or how much difference it will make if they are constantly, daily being subjected to the kind of rhetoric they hear. And what's amazing is that quite often the think tanks and so on start justifying the leadership. This happened here with the war on terrorism and the Gulf War and so on. And it happened in Israel also, the justification of the more extreme stances that take place. So nothing wrong with breaking through that, I think.
Pass it on.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and the last question, John.
Yeah, I don't have a question so much as just a comment. My name is Barbara Wien, and I'm representing 78% of the Jewish population in the United States that really supports freezing the settlements and the occupation.
Excellent, yes.
You mean the 78% that voted for Obama?
Well, yeah, they correlate, they track. But the anti-occupation movement coalition is alive and well in the United States.
Excellent.
It's growing.
Excellent.
And there's many, many voices that are being added to this. And I just want to convey this information back to the Palestinian community, if you would, please.
Certainly.
There's more and more delegations going over. There's more and more people gaining awareness. There's hundreds of teach-ins happening in the United States.
Excellent.
8 Jewish professors were fired from their jobs this spring for criticizing Israel on the bombings of Gaza, and they're all going to be meeting and speaking at a conference in Milwaukee.
Yeah.
We just had a huge teach-in and organizers conference in Chicago. Many hundreds of young organizers fanning out across the country to end the occupation. The boycotts, divestments, and sanctions movement is growing in the U.S.
Excellent.
And we are going to be marching in January in Gaza. And there's many people trying to raise money for the votes to lift the siege.
Yeah.
So it's just, there's so many voices, from President Carter, to break the silence, to combatants for peace. There's more and more school teachers getting involved. I speak in the synagogues all the time. So I feel like perceptions have not caught up with reality. There's a lag going on. And AIPAC is totally vulnerable. I mean, their contributions are down, their numbers are down. And the more we project power on them, the more people feel they are powerful, but they're not. And we need to speak the truth to power about this, that our numbers are growing. While I acknowledge that things have been getting a lot worse on the ground for Palestinians, we have broken through the rhetoric in this country.
That's
it started
excellent.
with the internet in 1992, where finally narratives from the Palestinian community were being directly broadcast here over the internet. But there's so many other things that have happened, where people are waking up to the reality, where the Israelis bombed Bethlehem on Christmas Eve. I mean, for many Christians, that was terrible. So there's so many watershed, landmark things that have been happening. And
Excellent.
I just want to convey that
That's
back.
very encouraging.
There's going to be thousands of us marching in Gaza in January.
Thank you. Can you get that message to Israel? Because it seems to me it's very important for the Israeli public to know. No, really.
They can't get a hearing in the press. And they can't get a hearing in the press here.
Yeah.
I think
There is a reality out there that is not being matched by the media perception. So just realize there's a huge gap.
Yeah, I follow up on the internet, what's being done, yes. And the BDS movement is certainly doing very well, yes.
no, thank you everyone for coming on that. I think on that last
Thank you.
note.
Thank you very much.